Welcome, everyone. My name is Ethan Marcus. I am the Director of Communications for the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, as well as a proud member of Kehila, Kedosha, Janina, Synagogue and Museum of New York. It's such a pleasure to welcome you all tonight to our first in our three-part series of Greek Jewry throughout the ages, Antiquity, Middle Ages, and Modernity. We're so glad for you guys to join us. And just to let you know, this partnership we started with many communities, including Kehila, Kedosha, Janina, Synagogue Museum, is part of a larger initiative through the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood called the Sephardic, including our communities around the country and around the world in Sephardic Torah, in Ladino language and culture, in history, in Greek Jewish history, in Roman history, in so many other cooking classes and a lot more things. And we're so glad to have you. And if you're interested in learning more about this amazing new initiative and actually see a lot of our educators, some of our educators, Sephardic Digital Academy. Now tonight, we have a very special guest, one who is also very close to my heart, I have to say, Marcia Haddad Ikonomopoulos, who is the museum director of our partner here today, Kehila, Kedosha, Janina, Synagogue Museum, the only Greek Jewish Roman museum in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Marcia has served as museum director of Kehila, Kedosha, Janina since 2004 and sits on the board of trustees of the Synagogue Museum. She also serves on the board of directors of the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative and is the president of the Association of Friends of Greek Jewry. She was born into a traditional Sephardic Jewish family from Salonika and has devoted her life to telling the story of Greek Jewry as an author, translator, editor, and lecturer. She holds 2 Bachelors of Arts, one from Brooklyn College in psychology and the second from Queens College in Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies, plus 2 additional masters, including the first in psychiatric casework from the New School, and the second in Italian from Queens College. So it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Marcia. Just unmute, and there you go. Marcia, we can hear you now.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Ethan. I want to thank the Sephardic Brotherhood and Kehila, Kedosha, Janina, my home away from home. It's so beautiful to see all these friendly faces. I can't see all of you at once, but I'm recognizing so many of you there. This is a special opportunity during this time when our museum has had to be closed to spread the word of who we are to the world. And I know that this is going to be seen and recorded by people from Israel and from Greece afterwards. This is the first part of a 3-part series. This is Antiquity. Ethan, could you put the first slide on so I see what I'm doing? Okay. This is going to cover the period, the Hellenistic period, from 332 before the Common Era to 142 before the Common Era. And then the Roman Empire took off over the same landmass. And so we will be discussing Greek Jewry in the Roman Empire from 142 BCE to 476 CE. And then the beginning of the Byzantine Empire. You can see on this slide here all the various places throughout this landmass where there were functioning synagogues. After the return from the Babylonian exile in the inter-temple period, there were many Jews that settled along the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean following the Persian trade route. So synagogues were set up in trade centers. And then with the coming of the Byzantine Empire, additional synagogues would be built. We have certain guides during this period that really showed us where Jewish presence was and where synagogues were. St. Paul, or Saul from Tarsus, was one of our early guides in the 1st century because he spoke from the beamers of existing synagogues, spreading the word of his new religion. We're going to be looking at Delos, which is right off the coast of Mykonos. So for those of you who go to Mykonos, take the short boat ride over the Delos and step back centuries into a whole completely different world. Delos is a sacred island. It was where Leto, the impregnated by Zeus, dropped her 2 children, Artemis and Apollo, to protect them from Hera, who wanted to kill them. Now, our interest, of course, is not in the going-ons of the Greek gods, but in the presence of the Jews on the island. Delos was the center of the Cyclades, and it was a commercial center. Jews were involved in commerce throughout the Mediterranean. They were experts in marine mercantile trade. So it is not a surprise to find a synagogue on the island of Delos. The next place we're going to go is Corinthos, or the Isthmus of Corinthos, where you cross over the Corinthian Gulf into, takes you into, to go on to Piraeus. Corinthos was in the 1st century of the Common Era. We know that there were Jews brought there from Eretz Israel to work on the building of the Corinthian Canal. Nero brought them over, and it is speculated that many Jews settled there afterwards. There was probably a Jewish community before then also. Our next stop will be the Agora at the foot of the Acropolis in Athens, 3rd century of the Common Era. Then on to the island of Egina in the Saronic Gulf, where 300 Common Era Jews went there after the Visigoth invasion. Verdia presents a synagogue built on the site of a former synagogue where St. Paul preached in the 1st century of the Common Era. Ethan, next slide. Okay. Our first stop is the island of Delos. You're looking at the chair of the prophet Elijah, Eliyahu Hanavi, which was a common symbol in early synagogues. This is also the chair where the father or godfather of the baby boy would sit for the circumcision. Eliyahu Hanavi plays a very important role in Judaism. He's to herald the coming of the Messiah, and he always makes his appearance at our Passover table. This is a marble chair, and you can see where it's located on the slide here. Up a little further, Ethan, over here. I don't know if you can follow my cursor or not. Okay. Technical. The chair is there, and of course, there's a body of water very close, you can see in the background. This was not used for a mikveh because it wasn't a natural flowing body of water. In fact, in many synagogues in Antiquity, because of the lack of flowing water, there was not a mikveh. During the Ottoman Turkish period, Jews would use the hammams, or the Turkish baths, for their mikveh. The beaver would have been juxtaposed to the chair of Eliyahu Hanavi. Next slide. Ethan. Okay, we're going to Corinthos. Now, the menorah was a symbol, excuse me one second, that was used and was a sign that we were at a Jewish site. It's the earliest symbol of Judaism before the Star of David, the Mogen David. And this is found on columns in Corinthos. Next slide, Ethan. This is an inscription from the 5th century of the Common Era reading Synagogue of the Jews. Now, this is in Greek. Now, synagogue is a Greek word, synagogue. It means gathering place. And with the loss of the temple, or during the intertemple period, where Jews would settle in areas where they were not close to the temple, they built gathering places to worship. And that's where we get synagogue. There are other things within the synagogue that come from the Greek, the bima, which comes from the Greek word vima, and afikomen, which is the piece we break off at Passover, comes from the Greek word afikomen, which is something you have at the end of the meal. Ethan? We're now in the Agora at the foot of the Acropolis. This is the Roman Agora. There were no finds of an ancient synagogue from the Hellenistic period. So this is from the Roman period. And this, of course, is a picture of what people feel it looked like. The pagan Greeks would go up to the Acropolis to make sacrifices to their gods. And Jews would, on their Shabbat, on Saturday, worship at their synagogue. The synagogue was found, the remnants of it, in the center of the Agora. The fact that it was in such a prominent place and in a commercial area, again points to the fact of how Jews were prominent in the commerce of the time. Ethan, next one. our lovely menorah again, which distinguished the synagogue that was found in the Agora. And this is the location where it was found. Next slide. And this is the stone that really designated the synagogue, or the synagogue, that was found in the ancient Roman Agora. Next slide, Ethan. During the invasion of the Visigoths from the north in the 3rd century of the Common Era, Jews fled from Athens. It was only a small community, and it's believed that most of them fled to the island of Egina in the Saronic Gulf. This is the tile floor where the synagogue was located. Elias Messinas, who is an Israeli Greek-Jewish architect, and his wife Yvette, who comes from the Nachmias family, have been working to preserve this site here and have raised interest and funds, so hopefully the site will continue. When you get off the boat on the island of Egina, it's right to the left, again in a very prominent location. Next slide, Ethan. Ethan? This is the actual floor, what it looks like. And you can see the vastness of it, the Greek inscriptions. There is nothing of the synagogue itself, so we can only speculate what it looked like. Ethan, the next slide, please. This is the present synagogue in the city of Veria, and that's actually where the Marcus family came from. Mordecai was the family name. And we've had some very emotional times there where they've actually found writings in the synagogue pointing to their family's presence there. I'm showing this, you can go back to it, Ethan. You've got to work out these technicalities. I'm showing this because it sits on what is the site of a former synagogue. Veria was one of the places where St. Paul preached. He preached from the bemas of the Eastern Mediterranean, preaching his new religion, Christianity. It's mentioned in his letters, his epistles, that he preached in Salonika on 3 consecutive Shabbats. He wasn't welcome there, and then he went on to Veria. He also preached on the island of Rhodes, in Corinthos, in Patras. So we know where he's our guide into the 1st century Jewish presence. Next slide. I'm going to move over now into Asia Minor. Since we're using as our border language rather than actual physical borders, there are many borders that separate lands. Some are natural, some are man-made, some are just lines saying this is me and that's you. I'm using the perimeter of language, the shared language and culture of the Jews of this period. So we're going to be going to Ephesus, which is in Anatolia, dating back to 500 before the Common Era. Sardis, which is in the 3rd century before the Common Era. And then on to Dura Europos, which is now physically located in what is Syria, from 244 of the Common Era. We can move on, Ethan. This is Ephesus. Many of you have probably been there as a major stop on the cruise lines when they do that short cruise. It's on the coast, not too far from Smyrna, or as it's known now as Izmir. You can see here the library, and the synagogue was located in this area over here. The building is not intact, but it's definitely marked again with menorah, that we can see where the synagogue was. Next slide. This is the actual, what the synagogue was to look like. And we can see the columns. And it was a large building. It was a prominent building in the city of Ephesus. And Ephesus was a city of commerce. It was located on the Mediterranean, not on the Mediterranean, the Aegean Sea. And it was a city of many cultures and many religions. You had pagan Hellenistic culture there, you had early Christianity, and you had Jewish presence. Next. This is one of my favorites. This is Sardis. And Sardis is located north and east of Ephesus, further in on the mainland. There are many things that are fascinating about this synagogue. First place, it shows that this was a very large, prominent Jewish community. It's one of the largest synagogues that we've seen, at least the foundations for it. It's also a synagogue without a roof. It was so hot. The columns are there, but there is no sign there ever existed a roof. It certainly would have been stifling to worship if it was closed. Next slide. This is also one of the fascinating things about Sardis, and that's the double echal, where the Aron, where the Torah scrolls would be kept. There were two, and the only other place in the Eastern Mediterranean that we have seen this is in this present synagogue on the island of Rhodes. Next. This is written in Greek, and this was a donor to the synagogue. I mean, we always see these, the prominent, the wealthy, the donors get their names someplace inside the synagogue. I'm sure every synagogue you've ever been in, you see this, and it was no different in Antiquity. Next, this is the courtyard there, and you can get an idea of the vastness of this synagogue by how the large area of the floor there. Next. Now, this is a creation from the Museum of the Diaspora in Tel Aviv to show what the synagogue would have looked like. And this would have been the bima, Lions of Judah, and the tiled floor, which was a prominent feature in synagogues. Jewry Europos, in what is now Syria. Jewry Europos was a major center of trade in the 3rd century of the Common Era. It was destroyed by the Persians in the 3rd century. The synagogue was protected by filling in the area with sand so that it wouldn't be destroyed during the takeover by the Persians, and was not uncovered until 1932, when the archaeological finds showed this magnificent and fascinating synagogue that raised many questions. Next. Okay, Jewry Europos was inhabited by pagan Hellenes, early Christians, and Jews. This particular fresco is from the synagogue. And when the archaeologists found this, it's completely shocked them, because we're not supposed to have any human representation inside a synagogue. And yet what happened on the walls of the synagogue was the telling of the story of Judaism. Next. Ethan. This is the story of Moses, Miriam placing Moses into the sea. Certainly not visuals you would expect to see in a synagogue. And this is the story of Aaron here. The only thing that would distinguish these visuals from very similar visuals in both the pagan temple and the Christian church was Hebraic symbolism, such as the menorah. These were 3 religions that were in competition with each other. And if anything, the visuals inside the synagogue show the Jews to be the most prominent and wealthy of the 3 separate religions. You know, at a time before people were literate, visuals were used to explain the religion. If you go into early churches anywhere, you'll look at the beautiful mosaics, the frescoes, and the church of St. Francis of Assisi in Assisi told the whole story of Christianity. People would be able to see the story. If you go into Greek Orthodox churches, the icons tell the story, and people would be able to see because it wouldn't change. They knew exactly who they were looking at. We don't think of this in Judaism, and yet Jewry Europos shows us that it existed in Judaism also. Next slide, Ethan. I'm going to move on to Italy now. Now, parts of Italy were known as Magna Graecia, or Greater Graecia, because the Greek Hellenistic Empire and Roman, under the Romans and under the Byzantines, extended onto Italian soil. Magna Graecia is usually thought of as the eastern coast of Italy, going down from Venice along the coast into Bari and Brindisi, and then on to Sicily. But there were also beautiful finds of synagogues further west in Italy with Greek writing. So I'm going to include that here. Ostia Antica was in the 1st century of the Common Era until the 4th century of the Common Era. And Bova Marina is in the 4th century of the Common Era. Next slide. This is the synagogue in Ostia Antica. Ostia Antica was the port city for Rome. Now, we learned many interesting things about not only the synagogue there. By the way, in this particular period in the Roman Empire, Judaism was considered a cult, and not with the negative connotation of we think of cult nowadays, but believers of a different faith, the others, the non-Romans. And there were many such cults, and they were allowed to exist. They were allowed to build their places of worship. Ostia Antica was a port city, and as such was a center of commerce. And as such, again, Jews played a prominent role. We also know something else about Ostia Antica, because with the bringing of Jews as slaves into the Roman Empire, those of you who have been to Rome know of the Arch of Titus, where the actual bringing of Jews as slaves is depicted. We know that the nearby city that ransomed the Jewish slaves was Ostia Antica. Very early on, Jews set up a ransom system, and it was incumbent upon the community closest to the enslaved Jews to ransom them. And in this case, Ostia Antica was the one who played the ransom to free the Jews that would settle in Rome. Again, our menorah. Again, there were a number of menorahs designating the synagogue site in Ostia Antica. Ethan? Okay, this is Bova Marina. Bova Marina is located in the Arch of the Boot in the south of Italy, on the border of Calabria and Apulia. It's a fascinating place, and I first learned about Bova Marina when I was going for my master's in Italian at Queens College, where the head of the department gave me a manuscript that he couldn't read. It was in Latin letters, but it made no sense to him. And as I started to read it, I realized it was transliterated Greek. So I was able to translate it for him. Bova Marina still has a native Greek-speaking population, and young people from Bova Marina go to Greece every year to maintain their ability in Greek. These are some artifacts found on the site of the Synagogue of Bova Marina, and again, the menorah. I'm moving over to the Jewish catacombs. South of Rome on the Via Appia, there are a series of catacombs. Jews began to bury in catacombs. Christians did also. This was during the period when persecutions set in against both Christians and Jews. In fact, it is believed that Jews worship clandestinely inside the catacombs, and we can see from many of the decorations, it was more than just a burial place. Next slide. This is actually a beautiful inscription written in Greek. Here lies Primitiva and her grandson, Euphoron, may they rest in peace. And again, the menorah. Next slide. This shows you some of the decoration here. And this is why I say this was used as a place of worship and not just a place of burial. During the persecutions where Jews were actually being thrown to the lions along with Christians, there was the need to worship clandestinely. This is close-up of a coin found in the Jewish catacombs in Rome. And this is an ancient inscription. I'm moving over to Israel now. We're not going to really discuss synagogues in Israel until the next in the series, but I could not resist presenting this because it's such a beautiful example of classical Greek. Classical Greek is not easy to read because there's the words, one word goes right into the other, and it's very difficult to decipher. Fortunately, I had a translation of this because I would not have been able to decipher it myself. Here you can see something else which is of interest that was found right outside the temple area in Jerusalem. A little forbidding here. Let no foreigner enter within the parapet and the partition which surrounds the temple precincts. Anyone caught violating will be held accountable for his ensuing death. Not welcoming. But again, the Greek writing is beautiful here. We're going to be talking about Israel in the next session. I just want to wind this up with some thoughts before I open it to questions. Looking at the synagogues, looking at the sites, what can we learn about Jewish life in antiquity? First of all, to me, a good way to learn how comfortable Jews felt in their environment was how and where they built their synagogues. If their synagogues were built down an alleyway, out of the sight of the general population, hidden from the non-Jews, you knew Jews were living in fear. These synagogues that we looked at, coming from antiquity, were all freestanding, prominent structures, which shows that Jews in antiquity for the most part, felt free to express their religion. There would be persecutions that would set in later. I'm not saying there was no anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism, and I'll qualify those terms in a moment. We certainly know the story of Hanukkah. We would be fools to think that there were no persecutions in antiquity, but they weren't quite as severe or prominent as in later periods of Jewish history. In fact, Jews went to Caesar's funeral en masse. They were good citizens. They paid their taxes. They were good citizens in antiquity, whether it was in the Hellenistic Empire or the Roman Empire. We do have one piece of writing that points to Hadrian and how he felt about Jews. First, let me qualify my terms. Anti-Semitism is a modern term that didn't come about until the end of the 19th century. And in anti-Semitism, you were a Jew because you were a Jew. It was in your blood, and you couldn't change it. Even converting to Christianity would not protect you from persecutions. Anti-Judaism predates anti-Semitism, and throughout much of Jewish history, that was the prominent means by which Jews were persecuted. If you wanted to give a rationale for anti-Judaism, if you honestly believe that Jews were responsible for the death of your Lord, and in the case of Christianity, the belief that Jews were culpable in the murder of Jesus, you can understand animosity. Anti-Judaism does allow for conversions. And if a Jew converted to Christianity, then he was no longer persecuted. Hadrian points out something when we question where does anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism come from, and it's sort of frightening. The story goes, and Hadrian, of course, was a Roman emperor, dating back to the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. In this tale, he was leading his entourage through the streets of Rome to his palace. And as he passed, his subjects would bow in respect. Along the way, he saw a Jew that was bowing. He stopped his entourage and ordered his men to kill that Jew. Now the question arises, how did he know he was a Jew? Jews would dress distinctively different. It wasn't a matter of wearing a mark like what would take place later on, but their garb was distinctive enough to separate them from the non-Jews. Not intentionally, but because of the way they dressed. Moving along, Hadrian saw another Jew that wasn't bowing down because he saw what happened to the first Jew. And Hadrian stopped his entourage and said, "Kill that Jew," which is what happened. When they got to the palace, a man in his entourage stopped him and said, "I don't understand what happened. You killed the first Jew because he bowed down to you. You killed the second Jew because he did not." And Hadrian said the now famous words, "I do not have to explain why I hate these people." And for the most part, whether it be anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism, is an inexplicable hatred of another people, something we still deal with today. What we can learn from the synagogues that we looked at is that Jews took a part in the life of the communities they lived alongside. Jews, for the most part, being a small minority surrounded by a non-Jewish world, would adopt much from that non-Jewish world, whether it was the way we named our children, the foods we ate, incorporating our laws of kashrut, but eating pretty much the same foods, the way we dressed, and even what happened in our liturgy. Jews took a prominent role in the commercial world of their non-Jewish neighbors throughout antiquity. And in some instances, such as in Jewry, Jews were the most prosperous of the religious sects. We see the layout of synagogues. You know, there was no blueprint that we had on how to build synagogues. We know how the temple was built. It's very explicit in our scriptures, the material that was used, who the builders were. But once we were on our own, we used primarily the style that was prominent at the time. And for the most part, we did not build our own synagogue. Non-Jews built them. So you can see throughout history, and we'll see this when we move into the Byzantine period, very little difference between Byzantine churches and Byzantine synagogues. We also see that the material used, you know, those of you who have been to Janina, you would say, "Oh my God, what a wealthy community this was. Look, they have a marble arong there, beautiful marble." It's not that they were so wealthy. Marble was very prominent in the area, and that's what they used. What is noticeable is early back, the tradition was that the Aron, where the Torah scrolls were kept, would face Jerusalem. So in cities that were to the west of Jerusalem, the Arons were on the eastern wall. Cities that were north, it was on the southern wall. And if they were south of Jerusalem, it would be on the northern wall. So this we see in the layout of synagogues back in antiquity. I'm going to open the floor to questions. At least Ethan is going to open the floor to questions, okay?
So this is, thank you so much, Marcia. Beautifully done. Wonderful. As always, we know you're a wealth of knowledge. We're gonna, like Marcia said, we're gonna open up the floor to questions for Marcia on this first topic for our talks. You can do either one of two things. You can either type it into the chat. There's a little chat box. If you click on the bottom of your screen, you'll click chat. You can type into the chat box. You can read out the questions and Marcia will answer them. Or you can use the digital raise hand function. If you click on participants and you find your name on the participant, you click more. There's a little blue hand icon that can pop up. You can also ask questions through that as well. We can call on you. I actually do have a question for Marcia, first of all. At what point, I'm curious, at what point do you define these Jews as Romaniote Jews? What do you consider them Romaniote from the inception of them leaving Jerusalem? Is there a period of time where they're not, we just call them Jews? Is there a period of time they transition? When does that happen?
Okay, technically the phrase was coined in the 4th century when Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from the city of Rome to a city on the Bosphorus called Byzantium, and that's where we get Byzantine. But I like to think of it as earlier. Romaniote are Greek-speaking Jews, and they were speaking Greek back into antiquity. So a good 500 years before Constantine, these Jews were speaking Greek, and that's really what denoted them or distinguished them. Did I answer?
Yes, thank you, Marcia.
Okay.
And we have a question in the chat box. Do you have any information about how the Jews that were Roman slaves came to Janina?
Okay, we know there is the oral history that the Jews came to Janina on a slave ship that was forced to land off the western coast of Greece. And then they made their way up by foot to Janina. And I used to poo-poo that until I met a lovely man who was an Albanian marine archaeologist and who told me that they found the remains of Roman ships in the strait between the southern part of Albania and the island of Corfu that dated back to the 1st century. Now, if they landed, and by the way, there was no Greece until 1821, and Ipodus, the area where Ioannina is, also encompassed parts of Albania. So it made sense if they landed in like Saranda, which is in the southern part of Albania, they could walk straight across. They didn't have to be mountain goats and climb up the coastline there. So that's the oral history. Do we have anything of substance to prove that? No. There is no sign of a Jewish presence in Janina until the 8th century, when we have writings from the church denoting Jews as they were responsible for cleaning the churches. And they mention a family name there, but that's the only mention of a Jewish presence in Janina. I believe they were there much earlier, because Janina is on a major trade route. It's on the extension of the Appian Way. There was a road that went up that went from Janina through Kastoria, through Salonika, and then on to the silk trade in the east. So I'm sure they were there before the time of the 1st century.
Great. And now I have a question here from Sarah Crocker, who's raising her hand on the screen.
Hi, Sarah.
Sarah, can you hear me? Or maybe you can help. Yeah,
Yes.
there you go.
Yes, I can hear you. Marcia, I just wanted to say thank you very much to both you and Ethan for putting this on. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate Sarah has come to Greece with me, as has her sister and many members of her extended family.
Now we have another question in the chat. How did the Jews arrive in Magna Graecia as slaves, and why did they retain the Greek language? So I think the first part was kind of empted, but the second part.
Right, okay. Magna Graecia, you know, we tend to think very narrowly now when we think of borders. At the time I'm talking about, borders were very fluid. Even later on, I mean, my grandfather used to say, from Salonika, I went to sleep a Turk, I woke up a Greek. I mean, borders changed. We didn't live in this narrow world, but borders were always the same. Greek was the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. And so Jews settled in that area. Last summer, I was on the island of Sicily in the city of Syracuse, and there was a mikveh there that dated back to Greek presence on the island, Greek Jewish presence. So why did they go there? We know the story of being brought by slaves during the Roman Empire, but we also have proof that they were there before. But the argument that the Italians give that they had the oldest Jewish presence in the European diaspora, not true. Greek Jews do.
We have another question in the chat. Is the symbol of the menorah an exclusive symbol to Judaism?
I believe so. You know, it's a symbol of worship, and it was a symbol that is shown throughout Jewish presence going back to Antiquity. On the other hand, the Star of David, the Mogen David, is not necessarily only a Jewish symbol. You'll find it used in decoration. I remember I really had to grit my teeth. I was in Florence, and this tour guide was giving us a tour and pointed up to the facade of Santa Croce, a church there. And there's a very prominent Mogen David, a window up on the top. And she's telling the crowd, I did control myself, Ethan, how the church was built by Jews, and that's why the Mogen David was there. First place, there were no Jews in Florence until hundreds of years afterwards. Second of all, Jews were not allowed to be part of the Builders Guild. And third, the Mogen David was used by both Muslims and Jews as decorative symbols. So where I can attest to that, I haven't found any proof of the menorah being used by anyone else other than Jews. If you find anything, please get back to me.
Now we have a question here from Mike, who has a raised hand. Mike, let's see if I can unmute you, if you can ask your question. Mike, are you there? All right, we'll come back to Mike then. We have another question in the chat. What is known of the history of the Jews, of how the Jews arrived in Castoria? Do they date from the Inquisition, or were they Sephardic Jews? Did they also migrate over there from time for other cities?
Okay, the history of the Jews in Castoria, in the first place, there was a Romano-Jewish presence there, as there was in all Jewish communities throughout what is now modern Greece. And there was a large number of Romano Jews that were taken into the Ottoman Turkish Empire, into Istanbul, Constantinople, and there's an early Castorali church there dating back to the 15th century. The Jews of Castoria, the majority of the Jews, the Sephardic Jews, came there after the expulsion from Spain. And they came by a very interesting route because they came through Yugoslavia, or what is now Yugoslavia, crossing over from Trieste into Yugoslavia, and then down the coast. And this is why, into modern times, there was a very close relationship between the monasteries and the Castoralis. But the majority of the community, as happened in most places throughout Greece, the overwhelming presence of the Sephardim absorbed the indigenous Romano Jews. After 2 generations, the Romano Jews were now speaking Ladino. One of the few places that this didn't happen was Janina, and that was because of the isolation, because of the Pindos mountain range. They were very insular over there. And even in modern times, I remember the first time I went from Salonika down to Janina by bus, it took me 7 hours. Now, at one time, before the modern road, it used to take you days to go in between the two. But I think I answered the question. Next question.
Why was the name, from our friend Elliot Colchamiro, by the way.
Elliot Colchamiro, okay, okay.
Why was the name Maza so common in Janina?
Okay, we have many theories on that. It is believed that probably they were people that were involved in the production of matzot. But there are others that say they came by way of Italy, and that there was a city in Italy named Mazza, M-A-Z-Z-A. You can see the difference between the spelling of the name in Janina by the majority of the Jews who are matzahs, and then the spelling on the island of Corfu, where there are mazzas and matzahs. But if you look at how do we pronounce the word P-I-Z-Z-A, we pronounce it as if it had a T, pizza. So Mazza and matzah are the same name. Why are there so many? I don't know, Elliot. You were very prolific.
We have another question here. Was it common for Jews from Janina and Salonika to marry?
Was it common from Jews and from Janina
to marry? Jews from Janina and Salonika to marry one another?
No, it was not. It was really considered an intermarriage, even into modern times. I went to and this was not only for Salonika, but also Castoria. I went to a wedding in the 1950s, I believe it was, where the bride's family was from Castoria and the groom's family was from Janina. The marriage didn't last, by the way. But I think Ray Dalvin summed it up beautifully when she said, the Jews would say in Arta, God protect us from the Christians of Arta, and in Previca, God protect us from the Turks of Previca, and God protect us from the Jews of Salonika. There was really a lot of animosity between the two. The Jews of Salonika looked down on the Jews of Janina, thinking they were uneducated, not really understanding them. You know, going back to the very beginning of the settlement, of Sephardim in Salonika, because when they came there, they found Jews, not only the indigenous Roman or Greek-speaking Jews with a synagogue there called Etz Chaim, but also Jews that had come from Ashkenazi lands and had their own synagogues. The Jews from Salonika would call the Jews Grecos, the Roman Jews, and that was a derogatory term. But they weren't very kind towards the Italian Jews. They called their synagogue La Synagoga della Macaroni. And then the ultimate insult for the Ashkenazim, La Synagoga de los Locos. They thought they were crazy. They could not understand what language they were speaking. And it always amazes me, we're so small in number, but this carried over when they came to the United States too. That little insular feeling that we were different. The Sephardim on the Lower East Side looked down on the Yadoti Jews. The Ashkenazim didn't even think they were Jewish. How could you be Jewish? You don't speak Yiddish. Well, the laugh is on all of them because we're still there. Next question.
We have a question here from David and Naomi, who are actually from Australia, I believe.
Oh.
Hi, Marcia. I hope you can hear me. I just want to thank you very much for connecting me up a couple of years ago to your shul. My great-grandfather, David Mordechai Levy, my mother told me he was from Janina, or actually possibly Turkey. He married my great-grandmother in Corfu, and then they travelled to London, and then I ended up in Australia. But so that's from my maternal side. So I just wanted to ask you, please, was it common for many Jews to come from Turkey, possibly to Greece? I apologize, I did join the session a bit late.
Was it common for many Jews from Turkey to come to Greece? Well, it was all Ottoman Turkish Empire. Until 1912 and 1913, Jews in Salonika became part of modern Greece in 1912, and the Jews in Janina in 1913. And when you look at the ship manifests, you can find in one family, a couple coming from Janina, where one member of the couple, the wife will say she's Greek, and then the husband will say he's Turkish. And they both came over on the same ship in the same year. So how that identification was made, but it was no different. It was all the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So they went back and forth. And you have even names that spoke to that. The surname Politis meant someone who worked in Ipoli, which was, of course, Constantinople. And this applied to Jews and Christians. You have names like Hajjopoulos. Now, a Hajj for Muslims are someone who goes to Mecca. For a Jew, it was someone who went to Jerusalem. But the name is actually Turkish. So you can see the mix-up in everything that went on there. It was predominantly a Jewish world that came in contact with the Muslim Turkish culture and the Christian Greek culture. I had a teacher going back in Queens College when I was going for my second degree in Byzantine and Modern Greek, Professor Orphanos, who was one of my favorite. And even though I was taking a crazy course called Mickey Theodorakis, his music and his politics, we would talk. And he said to me, Marcia, if you really want to know about the history of Greece, look at your own history. Because Jews were there before many of what people think of the indigenous Greeks. We were there, going back at the very beginning. And we passed through all these empires. So it was, but we were who we were. The empires changed, but we were Jews living in those empires. By the way, I have many Australian Jewish friends from the Asimo family, which were from Corfu. And you have to come visit us in New York, and you have to come with us to Greece one time.
Please God. Thank you.
Ethan?
We have another question over here. How do the Jewish communities arrive to the island of Crete?
Well, there's a question there, and I was going to discuss it, but I didn't get around to it, because when you talk about where the first Jews were, in all likelihood, the island of Crete was in such close proximity to Jerusalem and the same thing with the island of Rhodes, that there were probably very, very early Jewish presence there. There is now archaeological work being done in Knossos, which is a major archaeological site there that goes back to the Minoan civilization, to see if there was any Jewish presence. They haven't found any yet, but it wouldn't be surprising if they did. And then, of course, if you speak to the Jews of Rhodes, they date their ancestry back to Genesis, because the Dodecanese Islands is mentioned in Genesis, and I would never argue with the Rhodesleys. Next question.
You don't really want to argue with Greek Jews of any kind at all.
No.
It looks like that's about all the questions. Are there any other questions? Anybody want to ask any final questions for this session? Either type them in the chat again, or use the blue digital raise hand function as well.
Okay, Anita Altman, any idea of how many Jews in the first century? Okay, you know, first century of the Common Era, there have been studies done, and this is of course talking within the Roman Empire. They have nothing in separation as far as where physically they were living, where they were living in what is now Greece or what is now Italy. But it is felt that there were about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire in the first century was Jewish. And on the other hand, about 10% of the population in the Roman Empire in the first century was Christian. One thing that I did not mention, Constantine the Great, who not only changed the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Byzantine or Byzantium, and he was born to a Jewish mother. His mother was born to a Jewish tavern owner, and Constantine, of course, is the one that converted to Christianity and became and at that point was the beginning of Rome as a Christian empire. I often say to myself, considering his background, what if Constantine had converted to Judaism? How different our history might have been. Would we have been more gracious than what took place when it became a Christian empire? We'll never know.
Looks like we have two more questions.
Okay. Oh, Leon, how you doing?
Track all the different questions.
Okay.
Let's see one here. What do you know about the Negrin family from Janina?
Okay, the Negrin family, I know quite a bit, and I've had the pleasure of meeting many of them. Many of them have joined me on my trips to Greece. The name Negrin is very prominent in Janina, but it's also very prominent throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The name made a voyage. It started in Spain as Negron, or black, and was often attributed to dark-skinned people. And many members of the Negrin family are dark-skinned. It then traveled through Italy, where it became Negrin, and then on to Greece. In the archives of Janina, some of the earliest entries, the name is written as Negrin. But of course, as the names are written in the archives, depends how the archivist was hearing it, because the Jews did not write down their names. At that time, they wrote their Greek and Hebrew characters. So they just verbally said the name, and as the archivist heard it, that's how he wrote it down. But there were many, many prominent Negrins from Janina and elsewhere, and also in Israel, there were very prominent Negrins there. Michael Negrin is an artist there. Very popular name in Janina.
We have another question here, and just to let everybody know, a reminder, some of these questions, which don't necessarily do with antiquity, which is fine, we'll definitely be answering in the next two sessions as well. One question comes from Erwin. I've heard different reasons on why Greek Jewry had the highest death percentage on the population in World War II. Your thoughts on the matter? And also, second question, is anti-Semitism prevalent in Greece today, notwithstanding its strong relations with Israel?
I knew we were not going to get past this without that question. It seems that the two questions that I hear the most, well, actually, there's three questions I hear the most when I speak, has to do with anti-Semitism, past and present in Greece. And then also Is it true that you name your children after living people? I get that all the time. And then the third one, do you really eat rice at Passover? So it shows you how people know so little about us, and they consider us very strange because of our customs. Getting back to your question, which I don't want to demean, it's a very, very important question. Greece does have the distinction of having lost the largest percentage of Jews during the Holocaust. 87% of Greek Jews perished. I've done a great deal of research on this. I've researched through the Auschwitz archives. I've written a number of papers on this. Simply put, Greece was cut off from communication when the Germans came in 1941. Radios were confiscated, newspapers were taken over, and the Germans put out a propaganda press then. They had very little knowledge of what was going on in other parts of the world. There were rumors coming in that Jews were being taken in Poland, Germany, but they didn't know what to believe. And in their innocence, they felt, well, okay, I can understand why the Germans don't like those Ashkenazi Jews, but what do they want with us? We have nothing to do with them. It was basically a very insular world. I was most taken back by a book that I translated that had 50 eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust that were written in Salonika. Not all of those survived the camps from Salonika, some came from other communities. One of the questions that was posed was, did you have a chance to escape? And if you did, why didn't you? And where the answer might have varied, it was pretty much the same thing. We came from a large family. I couldn't leave my parents to take care of the children. My wife was pregnant. I couldn't take her into the mountains. How can I leave my aging parents without my help? They did have the opportunity. They had Christian friends who forewarned them, come into the resistance movement. There's a lot of politics that went on. There are many that blame the rabbi there, Rabbi Koretz, and certainly he should be held culpable. Was he a collaborator? I don't think so, but he certainly was not a very wise, he was a weak rabbi. I'm sure his family and his young son was threatened, but simply put, it was the story of the Holocaust in Greece in many ways is the story of Salonika. Of the 76,000 Jews living in Greece, 56,000 were living in Salonika. So with the devastation in Salonika of 97% of the Jews, you can see why the figures are so high. Could those Jews have gotten out? There was an early book written by Dadovovich on the war against the Jews, where it made me cry because it was a very large book. I think it was over 600 pages. And there were about 4 pages dedicated to the Jews of Greece. And at the end, she said, I can't understand why so many Jews perished in a land where there were so many things that were working for their salvation. They were close to the water. They could have escaped to Turkey. It had one of the strongest resistance movements in all of Europe. There were many unanswered questions. Were there collaborators? Yeah, there were Jewish collaborators too, by the way. But I concentrate on those Christians who risk their lives to save Jews. That's what keeps my sanity. And I've gone all over Greece interviewing. We give an award through the Association of Friends of Greek Jewry called the Award of Moral Courage. We also put stories forward to Yad Vashem. My feeling is there were many Greeks that risked their lives to save Jews. In Yad Vashem, there are close to 400 that are honored, and it's only a very small percentage of those that should be. Why? We can go on forever and discuss this. Do I feel that Greeks were inherently anti-Semitic? No. Certainly no more so than any other country. And where today people think that the Greeks is the most anti-Semitic country, that's garbage. You know, that study that was done by the ADL, which, by the way, they retracted much of what they said. There were only 2% of the whole population that were interviewed, and so many of the questions were geared towards the answers they wanted to hear, the preconceived notion. Do you think Jews control the economy? That type of thing, the stereotypical anti-Semitism. I go every year, and I like to accentuate the good relationships that I've made there. In 2009, we had a terrible devastation of the Jewish cemetery in Janina. It was a very cruel anti-Semitic act. They went around the cemetery purposely picking out tombstones that belonged to Jews that still lived, with the ancestors of Jews that still lived in the community, to inflict the most pain. They knew what they were doing. Well, afterwards, there was a big to-do. And what was interesting were the newspapers covered this whole thing with the desecration. What they didn't cover was the reaction of the Christian community in Janina. They formed a human wall around the cemetery, holding hands and announcing to the world that they were not going to be defined by the fanatics within their midst. They showed their love to the Jewish community by personally going in there and helping to clean up, and marching from the cemetery to the center of town where the Jewish community was. I hope that answered your question. And thank you for asking it.
So with that, I want to be cognizant of our time for this evening. We're just about to wrap up. I first again want to thank Marcia for this incredible talk. This is again just the first part of a 3-part series on Greek Jewry throughout the ages. Part 2 will be next Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, on Byzantium and the Middle Ages period of Greek Jewry. I want to thank everybody again for joining us tonight. As you know, this is a partnership between the Sephardic Brotherhood and Kehila, Kedosha, Janina, Synagogue, and Museum. For more information, for any questions you have for us, you can either email Marcia directly at museum@kkjsm.org, which I posted in the chat. You can also email us at the Sephardic Brotherhood with any additional questions or comments, info@sephardicbrotherhood.com. And if you want to find out more about the Sephardic Digital Academy and any of our additional programs and classes, including some really great ones coming up in addition to that, tonight at 10:30, we have Topics in Halakha with Rabbi Ben Hassan from the Sephardic Kohanim Synagogue in Seattle. And this Wednesday, we have a special book talk with Dr. Sarah Bavaya Stein, the Viterbi Chair of Sephardic and Mediterranean Studies at UCLA. So that's going to be a great talk as well, and a lot more great programming coming up as well. And you can find this all at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy, and also additional information on Kehila, Kedosha, Janina, Synagogue, and Museum at kkjsm.org. Thank you all again so much. Thank you so much, Marcia, and we will see you all hopefully next week.